And just a reminder of our health and safety. We'll be talking a lot today about inequality as always, and some of the related issues such as gender stereotypes, our own unconscious and conscious bias, and gender-based violence. And some of these topics can be really challenging to talk about and think about, so it's just important for us to try and ensure that this feels like a safe space as always. So just a reminder, throughout the session today we will be talking about gender stereotypes and gender roles, and we'll often use quite binary language when doing this. So this is just to highlight that we know that gender is not binary, it exists on a spectrum, but we use this language to highlight the binary nature of the stereotypes. In today's session, we'll be focusing mainly on gender inequality, but we aim to be intersectional in our approach. So it's important when we're thinking about removing barriers for children of different learners that we are aware of how barriers might intersect for children who face multiple forms of inequality, and that we work to actively remove those barriers. Aim for this to be a learning space and a non-judgmental space to raise issues and to explore things like our own unconscious bias. So it's just important to remember that everyone will have different starting points and will be at different stages of their own personal journeys with regards to equalities work. So just trying to be accepting of different viewpoints and discussion whilst being aware of other people's lived experiences. You can use the chat pane, or you can just come in and speak if you want. Hi, Naomi.
Hi, I was just saying that I hadn't been at the first or second, so I didn't know. So I was just reflecting on a session that I'd had actually this morning with a group of young people who were equally males and females split, came in the room and sat at each side that they wanted to sit at. That wasn't directed. And when we were asking questions, I felt that the input from the females was always a bit deeper and went into it more. The boys were very one answers. We talked about doing different activities and what they would be liking to do. And the girls had said cooking at one point, and we had that discussion. And I was saying to the boys, what about you? Do you fancy cooking? And they were saying, no, that's a job for them. So you try to challenge that at the time. I think sometimes if you feel okay about it, and I was sort of saying, what do you mean it's a job for them? That's like, and do you eat? So, and just that trying to get them to talk about it, but they're very reluctant to engage because you're a woman and they're a young male, and it's just that's a woman's place, that's a woman's job. So it was difficult, but I do think I hope that there's a change now because of the gender work that's going on in nurseries. But I was saying that I had 2 boys and the oldest is 31 years ago. And I think it's very much about the education structure that we go into and the societies and the messages that they're getting from the society. Because I think in nurseries and a lot of schools were pretty good at the non-gender or the gender bias stuff. Yeah. But I think now, hopefully, there'll be a change further down. But I'm not seeing that change in 14-year-olds, just now.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well what you're saying about like obviously these gender roles are existing now with the education system. And if you came into a session yesterday or whenever it was, and the girls are saying, I want to do cooking, the boys are saying that's for girls. I mean, that's something that's been learned out with their education. So I was also really interested to hear about the fact that the boys were engaging differently with your sort of like questioning and trying to explore things as well. And did you find that you had to sort of amend your approach to allow for that? Yeah.
I think it's always that trying to encourage them to give you answers, and whereas the girls are giving you answers and maybe the reasoning behind their answers, like I want to do cooking so that I can learn different recipes, and they're just the more exploring. But again, that could be because I'm female, and had it maybe been a male that was talking to the boys, maybe they would have felt more comfortable, more open. So it's just being aware of that, I suppose, as well. Yeah, and we do usually try and have a mixed staffing at all these groups so that there is that sort of balance.
That would be interesting to look into that and see if the interactions are different depending on the gender of the practitioner involved. And you could explore that and see, like, is there anything that's kind of coming out in that? couple of comments in the chat pin there. Ms McKinnon, you're saying, I've noticed in how I expect boys to have more disruptive, disrespectful behaviour, get myself pumped up to deal with it before challenging behaviour has happened. Absolutely, I think that's a really common theme, and it's such a good thing to notice that, and for that to be something that you've acknowledged in yourself as well, because I think if we expect a certain behaviour, then we're going to have that sort of confirmation bias. The minute it happens, then you're like, well, I knew that was going to happen, and it kind of reinforces it a wee bit. So I'm just wondering, if there's maybe been space for you to reflect on anything you can put in place for yourself to allow yourself to get, more sort of, or not get pumped up for it, I guess. Starting with subsection 4A then, this is looking at curriculum and skills, and we know that awareness of skills is heavily influenced by gender stereotypes, and that this limits children's perception of what they're capable of and what transferable skills they might have. So the skills that we believe learners have will also be influenced by our own unconscious bias and expectations around gender. So making children aware of transferable skills that they do possess and providing lots of opportunities to safely explore new skill sets are key. Both myself and Amy will talk a wee bit about this later. But in terms of the curriculum, it's worth considering the contexts that we use to teach and ensuring that we're using contexts that have a broad appeal. So one example that can be quite alienating, that kind of comes up when we are sort of talking about this in our sessions, is the example of kicking a football to talk about calculating trajectory in physics. And this sort of reinforces obvious gender stereotypes, and then sort of obviously supposed to appeal to a particular group as well. But when we're looking to use more sort of varied examples, we would say to try and opt for subjects or contexts that are gender neutral or that subvert stereotypes, and try and use as many different examples as you can so that some of them will be appealing. There is a link here on this slide, which we'll send out with the slides, and this provides a checklist for selecting and developing resources, thinking about what kind of representation and examples are in those resources. So just with this in mind then, I want to give you a wee bit of time to sort of reflect quickly, just a wee minute of reflection, and then just sharing in the chat pane, thinking about the sort of traditional topics or areas of provision that you might talk about when you're teaching, and then considering the sort of countries, the people, the perspectives, and the examples that you use to talk about them. We've got a sort of list of them down there. So we've got World War I and II, authors, enterprise, scientific inventions, great empires, languages, home corner, building corner. But you can consider some other topics that you might be more familiar with, where you think there would be an opportunity to diversify and use perspective. That was certainly my experience at school as well. I think majority of my history teachers, in fact, I think all of them were men. And we got a very, and I only remember World War I and II, but it was from a very kind of like white British perspective. Yeah.
Hannah, just on that, I'm just going to post a link to the Promoting Race Equality and Anti-Racism Education GLOW site, because that's got curriculum ideas around English and literacy, maths and numeracy, and health and well-being, that looks at sort of moving away from that approach, and then eventually there will be other curriculum areas when they've been updated. So I'll pop that in the chat in case that's helpful.
Yeah. I've got a bunch of stuff in here. So Susan, you're saying good to teach using the works of male poets alongside destructive violence authors, a good mix of authors, but do veer towards male writers of edgier works such as Salinger to encourage a boy-heavy class. Yeah, so it's interesting striking a balance there. We, particularly within English, we know that boys can sometimes be less engaged. So how do you build that engagement and find texts that are going to be relevant, whilst also ensuring that there's equal representation? I do think that's something that's, needs to be thought about carefully as well. So thank you for raising that. We've made a conscious decision to include positive females in our history and primary. It's great to hear. Thanks, Amy, for sharing that. Scientific inventions tend to be very male dominated by the examples used, penicillin, engines, etc. Florence Nightingale, as an example, is of a statistician and inventor of the pie chart. Well, I didn't know that, so thank you. In terms of developing a wide array of skills, building confidence is key. So therefore, it's important for children and young people to feel safe to try and fail with low consequences, and that failure is perceived to be part of the learning process. And so this is particularly pertinent for learners of different genders or backgrounds who don't feel that a particular subject area is for them. For example, girls who are exposed to the low-level stereotype that maths is masculine. And so for these learners, perceived failure will have a bigger consequence and might lead to disengagement. So some theories say that a competitive environment helps boys in particular to thrive, especially if they have a history of not engaging. But again, we need to proceed with caution here, as this reinforces a particular stereotype and can actually cause undue stress, and learners who don't succeed in the competition will disengage more, and it will alienate learners who don't live up to this stereotype. So therefore, we suggest a balance of cooperative and competitive approaches where cooperation can build trust required to help establish a safe space for failing. As with everything, all work in this area should be child-led, allowing them to have more control over the curriculum and the skills they develop, and providing language and tools to identify these skills and how they map out across the different pathways will empower all learners to help build engagement. And this slide here is just reinforcing the last slide. Making skills explicit and weaving through the curriculum will build confidence around skills developed and open up pathways. And this can be done in a number of ways. So talking about skills developed with children as they explore different areas and asking them what they are learning and where else they might use this particular skill. One school that we've worked with recreated their course choice leaflet to be more interactive. And they made a web page for it, so that when the learner explored each curricular area, the skills that they would develop would appear, as well as links to different subject areas where they would also develop these skills. That's the end of our sort of section 4A. So I'm just going to pass on to Amy, who's going to talk through the next B section. Amy, are you okay to take over?
Yeah, Hannah, are you happy to keep sharing?
I'll keep sharing, yeah, no bother.
Thank you. And hi, everybody. It's lovely to meet you all. And I'm very much looking forward to working with you all throughout the course. As Hannah said, I'm just back from parental leave, so there's definitely some parts of my brain missing slightly in terms of what's going on. And I can only apologise. It was me that abruptly brought you back from your breakout rooms, because I forgot that there was a possibility or a setting to put a timer on. So the next breakout room, I'll put a timer on. I won't suddenly disrupt you all as you're speaking. So thinking now about 4B and career education, here are some quotes from young people around how they feel they're directed towards or away from certain choices. I'll let you read the slide. I won't read it out for you, but sort of a variety of different experiences from girls and boys there on the slide. And we know that gender stereotyping will have been present in many aspects of their life up until this point, from how we play with different gendered babies to the clothing girls and boys wear, the adverts different children watch, making some toys seem like they're for girls and some toys seem like they're for boys. And this leads to stereotypes around jobs and careers, with children seeing, for example, more men as firefighters and more women as nurses, and having the myths about boys being naturally stronger and girls being naturally more caring perpetuated constantly, or indeed, cooking being for girls. So girls and boys are subtly, or sometimes not so subtly as these quotes show, guided in different directions. And if there's been very little put in place to challenge the gender stereotyping, it won't be surprising to see the difference in girls and boys' confidence, a difference in the skills that they might develop, and then ultimately the choices they end up making as well. So as a starting point related to this, we could begin to consider asking ourselves, when are the moments that stereotypes, bias, sort of everyday sexist language might be used around career education? How is this biased language challenged, both when young people say it to us, but also perhaps when colleagues say it to us as well, or we hear colleagues expressing it to children and young people? How are we describing jobs, careers, learner pathways, tasks and skills? What language are we using? And finally, what actions can we put in place to mitigate gender biases in relation to career pathways as well? Thanks, Hannah. I realised, sorry, you went out to, sorry about that. So some of the sort of additional things to consider are to what extent can our learners relate their learning and skills to the world of work, free of these preconceptions that we've outlined? How can the links to skills and learner pathways be embedded in the environment and the sort of the learning that happens every day, day to day? And then how well our colleagues and ourselves supported to give advice on pathways, including apprenticeships, but also how well do we feel like parents in the community that we work with are supported to give advice around other options, including apprenticeships as well. Thanks, Hannah. So when thinking about raising awareness of non-degree pathways for all and sort of helping to destigmatize workplace learner pathways, this will also help increase sort of skills awareness as we do this. A lot of the focus on the restructure of the SQA is to refocus on increasing awareness and accessibility around this and around work-based learning pathways for all, and to challenge the stigma around them, as this can reinforce prejudice and inequality. And of course, the stigma that can be related to non-degree pathways is absolutely also informed by unconscious bias and stereotyping, both sort of related to gender, but also related to poverty and race as well. So a big question for us all is how can we create or develop on opportunities to experience these options throughout the school or setting that we're working in. And also an aspect of engaging learners in different pathways is using role models and mentors. Now, there's probably more of a shift recently towards finding mentorship opportunities through linking with colleges and industries. But as we know, this can also be really challenging depending on capacity of the colleges and industries that we're asking to engage with. So equally, while role models can be really inspirational, they can also fall into that trap of being seen as exceptional, and thus making that pathway actually seem more daunting to children and young people, especially if this was just a standalone session with no additional support. So when we're thinking about our setting, thinking about how we're sort of supporting and buttressing any mentorship or especially role model work that we're doing is something really important to consider as well. So on that note, and thinking about role models and mentorship specifically, really quickly, I'm just going to pop a Padlet into the me trying to copy and paste into the chat pane, and depending on what your focus is, you know, a mentorship or a role model approach or a combination of the two actually might be what's best suited for your setting, for your practice, for your everyday work. So I'm just going to ask you to take 5 minutes to just fill in this Padlet. I'll pop it into the chat pane. Great. So thinking about choice now as well. Research shows that gender stereotypes and indeed other forms of stereotypes as well play a significant role in shaping the ideas that children and young people have about what boys and girls are good at, and eventually shapes their choices. Children will often adhere to gender roles when self-selecting in a play-based environment, so boys going to construction, for example, and girls going to home corners. And evidence shows that different types of play can lead to different types of skill development. Down the line, the awareness of prevalent stereotypes about one's own social group can have a negative impact on performance, even if we don't consciously believe the stereotype. And that there's research around that we can link to as well. And then finally, representation and associated perceptions of some subjects as masculine, feminine, or clever or easy can also impact on a learner's self-selection into or out of that subject and impact their choices they make around it. So thinking about choice, a combination of our unconscious bias, gender stereotyping, and our interactions might mean that certain choices actually feel just completely off limits to some young people. And that arises from a complex interaction of that self-identity, that confidence, and the skills that they've had the opportunity to develop, all of which, as educators, we can influence positively from a really early stage as well. And in terms of the why this is so important, if we think about the UNCRC, this links directly to Article 29 and the goals of education developing every child's personality, talents and abilities to the full. And also Article 15, so freedom of association, every child has the right to meet with other children and to join groups and organisations. And gender stereotyping and barriers related to that could be limiting and realising these talents, and also not letting children and young people feel like they can access activities or clubs, for example, as well. Thanks, Hannah. There's also research from a longitudinal study from UCL around identifications of cleverness, and that the research found that identifications with cleverness are not solely derived from academic attainment, but are actually really racialized, classed, and gendered as well. So cleverness is often aligned with being middle class, white, and masculine. In other words, girls, working class children, and minority ethnic students found it harder to be recognized as clever by their peers, by their teachers, and also in their own minds. And that's regardless of their attainment. It's not related to how they're actually attaining. It's those stereotypes related to cleverness. For example, within science and maths, girls often have lower confidence, and in part due to prevailing stereotypes about who is good at science and who is good at maths, and who we see in those roles as well. And this difference can be amplified when the context of questions, as Hannah said, and as we discussed earlier, is stereotypically associated with one gender. So that example of calculating a trajectory using a football, for example, could be a good example of that. Another one I heard recently was just all the examples of trajectory calculation being projectiles, military projectiles as well. So it's another one that's really gendered. And finally, confidence and self-concept can be built or undermined by the learning environment. So again, there's a real opportunity for us to be influencing those choices, but not at the point where the choices have been made, but much, much earlier instead. Thanks, Hannah. Or maybe not influencing those choices, maybe opening up those choices is a better way of phrasing that. And then thinking about language as well, language has the potential to profoundly influence our choices. Our interactions with and expectations of children and young people are influenced by gender roles and unconscious bias. For example, we might use gendered pet names. Errands are often gendered, with girls being asked to do more domestic or tidying errands, and boys perhaps being asked to do more sort of heavy lifting examples of sort of tasks and stuff. Evidence also shows that adults are more likely to praise girls for their clothing, hairstyles, neatness, and helping behaviours, and in contrast, praise boys for their strength, physical skill, size, and academic accomplishments. And also research in Norway found that early years practitioners were more likely to speak to girls using complex sentences and more complex vocabulary, and instead stuck to simpler sentences and simpler words when speaking to boys. And this is at a really early age, and all happening unconsciously as well for these practitioners. You know, they're not doing this on purpose. The example on the slide shows how this gendered approach to wording continues into job adverts, and that this will in turn impact choice. Evidence has shown that heavily gendered language in job adverts, and this could also be in course choice booklets, impacts on whether a person feels they are qualified to apply for a role, and this in turn sustains gender inequality and indeed pay inequality as well. So it's really important that we're considering the language we use when describing subjects, when we're describing pathways, when we're describing apprenticeships or careers. And there's a wee helpful tool that's also on the next slide, but I'll copy and paste it into here as well, which is just a gender language bias decoder from Total Jobs, which I have fun with sometimes, just putting jobs that education's got and put up and seeing if it's gender neutral or not. And it could be really helpful as just a wee tool when you're thinking about anything that you're writing down around careers, for example, with children and young people. Thanks, Hannah. So we'll have one more quick breakout room if we're happy, just to make it sort of 5-6 minutes. I'll put a timer on this time so you're not abruptly hauled out of it